Hello and welcome to another edition of Fide's podcast. My name is Jerry Serino and I'm your host, and I'm here with talent on loan from Rush. A lot of people have had to become experts in things that I'm sure that if they could, they would not need to be experts in various things. And one of those areas that to me has become the greatest, or certainly one of the greatest areas of concern and evil in this society, not just our country, but in the whole world, is the issue of transgenderism that's going on. To me, it is all a part of the diabolical, and it is very, very concerning to everybody. And as usual, there are lies and more lies about this issue. And that's why we need people like my guest today, Brandon Showalter. He is a journalist with the Christian Post. He's a podcaster, and he's also now an author of a great book called Exposing the Gender Lie. And he's here to talk. Brandon, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Jerry. It's good to be with you today.
Yeah, my pleasure. And this is, like I said, this is a topic that I feel like, are we really talking about this? Did you really have to become that knowledgeable in this topic? Would we have ever thought this? So, maybe start off with a little bit of background. Obviously, you're a journalist, you're a Christian. How did you get so involved in this particular issue?
Well, it's definitely not an issue that I ever thought I would be approaching.
Yeah,
I say sometimes, didn't sign up for it on career day at a career fair.
right.
If you'd have told me 10 years ago that I would spend now close to almost 7 years of my life trying to defend the material reality of biological sex against an incursion of an ideology that tries to convince children that they can be born in the wrong body, that they somehow can become the opposite sex, and that there would be this entire medical scandal attached to it, and there's this mass indoctrination campaign, and everywhere this dogma infects, it just brings ruin. I never would have believed you, because previously my knowledge of what any of this was about was, oh, you see transvestites at Mardi Gras, which I never go. And
Mhm.
it's just so bizarre. And like I never thought that I would have to become an expert, and I never even thought I would be doing journalism. And so none of this, no one is more surprised than me.
Mhm.
And that I look back on sort of God's providence as He would have it. I just realized how well I actually was prepared to do this kind of journalistic work. But I fell down this rabbit hole, as I like to say, soon after I got my start in journalism in the summer of 2016. And what was sort of the tipping point for me, it was kind of a series of moments when I learned all that this was about and what was happening, how laws were changing, how school policies were being adjusted to accommodate this ideology in the
Mhm.
classroom, was when I learned about the medical aspect, specifically what hormone blockers to delay natural puberty in children, what they were being used for and for what purpose. And when I learned about that, I just snapped inside and said,
Mhm.
okay, I won't have it on my conscience to be quiet about this, because this is evil. It's diabolical, to use the word you just did. Um, and so the rest is history. And ever since then, it's not been the only thing I've reported on here at Christian Post, but I've not shied away from it. And it's a pretty dark road, but sunlight, as we journalists like to say, is the best disinfectant. And thankfully, in this last year, there's been a critical mass, I think, starting to rise of people who are aware that it is as bad as we have been saying for years. There's been a few journalists like myself who've been relentlessly trying to raise the alarm about what's
Mhm.
going on, and finally we're being believed, which is nice. And now I think we have 13 or 14 states that have passed laws to restrict this kind of experimental medicalization for minors, but it has been a long time in coming, I can tell you that.
Yeah, and we need people like you because so much is hidden from the general public unless you're somebody who actively goes out and learns. and
Right.
and you could say this about any issue that's out there, in our society. It doesn't, not just this, is that if you're someone who just goes about your life, you don't really know all these facts, and we're naturally, in my opinion, lied to about so much. And
Yeah.
so we need people like you to actually gather the truth. You were on Tucker Carlson's. He did a documentary, and it was really phenomenal. It's a two-parter. I would highly suggest anyone goes and watches it. It is shocking. That's what Brandon and I were talking about before we started recording. Tell me about that experience, being a part of that.
Well, it's definitely a project that I was honored to participate in, and especially particularly given Tucker's stature. And interestingly enough, I had been praying and fasting, and one of the things I prayed was that, Lord, would you open a door to get this information out through Tucker
Mhm.
Carlson, and if I can be of use, please. And then in the summer of 2021, I happened to meet Walt Heyer, who was also in that documentary, and he's such a great leader. He's a man who I think he's probably 80 years old now, but he was one of the earliest people to ever undergo a surgical transition,
Yeah.
as they call it. And he introduced me and a friend who's also in the documentary to Tucker's producer. And so, sure enough, in the fall of 2021, I recorded what would later come out. It looks like 11 months after uh, Tucker Carlson's original Fox Nation documentary called Transgressive: The Cult of Confusion. And I thought it was particularly brilliant how Tucker structured and his team structured the two-part documentary, because he takes you through how this ideology operates and functions very much like a cult.
Hmm.
And my appearance in the second part, the beginning of the second part, is probably in the most grisly scene, where you see children, young people jamming needles into their flesh, pumping themselves full of hormones and blockers, and then body parts, perfectly healthy body parts, being hacked off, just in pursuit of a physical impossibility. And there I'm giving commentary about what it's like, hearing from families who've been torn apart by this, and asking the question, by what standard of biomedical ethics are doctors now removing physically healthy body parts? Under what ethical framework is that okay? And so I bring that experience in the documentary, and I thought it was very compellingly presented. It didn't quite make as much of a splash as Matt Walsh's film What is a Woman, but I'm so glad that Tucker threw his weight behind this issue. And I tell you, I meet Tucker as, he's probably the most visible conservative right-wing broadcaster in the country. But I can't tell you, Jerry, how many left-wing parents call me telling me that they are glued to the TV watching Tucker, despite disagreeing with him on most things, because he's a voice for their families, their daughters or their sons mired in this kind of madness, and Tucker is giving them hope. So, the truth is true no matter who says it. And so a lot of left-wing parents are watching Tucker because he's one of the few people in broadcast media who's actually speaking truthfully on this. And just goes to show you. And that they're reading my coverage. They're not religious, so they're reading the Christian Post, what I've reported, because when you tell the truth, it speaks volumes.
Yeah. No, it is amazing everything you said about Tucker, as I think he's right now, he's one of the most formative figures that
Mhm.
is out there in the media. And I mean that sincerely. I don't know him. This is, I just watch him, and he is really hitting the issues. And this is one of them that he has hit really hard. And you're
Yeah.
doing phenomenal work with this. So, gosh, there's so much I can talk to you about, and I want to try to get everything into my 30 minutes here. So, I want to start off with your book. Your book is called "Exposing the Gender Lie," and as we were saying earlier, the issue of abortion is all based on a lie. The issue, in my opinion, this is me saying this, not you, of the whole environmental movement is based on a lie. Everything that we're told by those on the left, they do so with lies, and not that they're simply wrong. People can be wrong. They're lying. So tell me about the lies in this gender, if as if it's not obvious what the lies are. In a way, it
Mhm.
seems silly, but we are truly being lied to. Take me through a few of the key lies that this side is telling us, and what people can find in your book.
Well, we came upon the title. I say we because my co-author, Dr. Jeff Myers of Summit Ministries, we were just thinking about, how do we talk about this bizarre issue of trans ideology, of gender ideology and culture? What's really at the core of this? Obviously, we see the medical scandal, and we see the twisting of language. We see how the institutions have been captured. We see just all of the sort of the history and the trajectory of things that have led to this point. And we just kind of settled on, really what this is a lie about the sex of the body. Male and female, God made us, Genesis 1:27. We at the Christian Post won't budge from that. But even if you don't believe in the Lord Jesus Christ, as I do and as you do, biological sex is a manifestly true scientific fact, easily observable with the naked eye. We're male and female. This was not controversial until what seemed like 5 minutes ago. And so there are many lies that are told in this space, and particularly when you think about what children are taught about biology, about sexuality, about, anything really, because there's not a single area. I said a moment ago, this stuff is everywhere. They'll put this into math problems. They'll put, I mean, just the gender, everything is just, the beast just devours everything it touches. And so the lie that is told to children and other vulnerable people in our society is that they were born in the wrong body. That somehow if they feel like the opposite sex, which what even is that somehow there's this other part of them that can be something other than what they are, that they are not an embodied person, that male or female is something that they can self-select for themselves. And instead of being the sex that they are, they can then choose from this ever-growing list of fictitious gender identities untethered from anything materially real, be it transgender or non-binary or genderqueer or allosexual or asexual or LGBTQ 123 XYZ WTF. I mean, it's just the list goes on. And Jesus, I keep it simple. Jesus said 2 words about sexual identity in Scripture: male and female. That's all. It also happens to dovetail with good science, and we talk about sexual orientation or gender identity, all of that. But at the core, gender ideology is predicated on a lie about the human body, that you can somehow be something other than what you are. And so when you can twist the language, our very means of communication, and convey to a generation of people by way of media and school and every other cultural force that is somehow real and true, you can make them believe anything. We actually quote in the book a lesbian feminist academic who says that the word trans, the prefix trans, has one function, and that is to falsify reality. Because as soon as you have a word that can institute the lie that a man is a woman, everything is reversed. We don't play any of the games with the manipulation and twisting of language at the Christian Post because we won't eclipse biological sex, because that distorts how we see the truth and reality. And we see Genesis 1:27 as make or break territory. And so that's why we just won't lie. But that's the long short of the story of why we stumbled upon the title Exposing the Gender Lie, because it is impossible to be born in the wrong body, and it is impossible for humans to change sex. And anybody who tells you otherwise is lying to you.
So a couple things, and again, you may cover this in your book, and you were not, obviously, in order to get the full story. And I really think this is something that all parents, even if you say, well, I haven't encountered this in my school, be careful, you will, right? You will. So, keeping yourself knowledgeable on this issue is super important. And, your book is certainly one of those ways. So, what do you think is the reason that people are out there, what is the reason that they're lying about all of this stuff, right? Saying, telling children. I mean, in the documentary Transgressive on Tucker, you were talking 3, 4, 5-year-olds that were being told one thing by their moms or their dads or their teacher. Why are they doing it? If they want to be transgender as an adult, I mean, I think that's still weird, but no one could stop a man from wearing a dress, whatever. But why did they go after the kids?
Well, I think there are many reasons for that. And as a Christian, I must start with just the reality of radical evil. And we see this, spiritually speaking, as just a demonic, diabolical attack on the image of God in every person. And there's a ruthlessness to that, where you see the assault on the human body at all ages. I mean, wherever. So that's sort of the backdrop, and that's the baseline foundation from where I start. But as Jesus said, the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil.
Mhm.
And I I say this in interviews that I do all the time, and it warrants bears repeating here, is that it's not tinfoil hat conspiracy to follow the money. Any journalist worth his or her salt should do that. And you can actually make a lot of money if you can entice children down this experimental medicalized pathway, get them to believe lies about themselves, and then sell them products and medical services, puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and body-altering surgeries. If you actually dig into the numbers and you dare to look at what these drugs cost and how they can enrich the pockets of big pharma and big medicine, it's so big it can't be ignored.
Mhm.
And some people say, well, this is a few little people, they're not really making money off of this. Like, the numbers keep skyrocketing, and
Yeah.
it doesn't take very many. My friend Jennifer Billick, who's done perhaps the best work on this of any investigative journalist in the country, has really drilled down and found how the medical industrial complex and others in this arena make cash hand over fist. Because if you put just a small group of children on puberty blockers for a couple of years, given what it costs for a subcutaneous implant to be inserted in their arm to deliver the drug, you multiply that. I mean, it's like thousands upon thousands of dollars. Then you multiply that out for a couple of years, and if you get more and more people on them, you're talking millions of dollars.
Mhm.
But it's not, these drugs and these medical treatments aren't really doing anything to help the body. And in fact, you'll even be more of a medical patient, a lifelong medical patient, if you stay on it. And then, of course, surgeries, the projection value, for the market projection value for those is, I think by 2026 was forecast to be something like $1.5 billion or something. So there's a lot of money to be made. Matt
Mhm.
Walsh in the Daily Wire uncovered actually a videotape of somebody at Vanderbilt saying that this is a great moneymaker for our
Yes.
hospital. So it's right from the horse's mouth that people are making money off of experimentally medicalizing otherwise healthy bodies. And so that is huge. Spiritually speaking, if I say, how do I sort of bring these two things together? You say Mammon and Moloch often operate together. The love of money, and then this spiritual evil that is sort of intent on destroying children, child sacrifice. Transgenderism is child abuse and child sacrifice. And
Yeah.
that's not kooky talk. It's really real.
Yeah, it's 100% real. And what's frustrating is, and again, this is my opinion, not yours. Whether you agree or not, I don't know. But I have foregone any kind of trust in the medical arena, certainly since COVID, and with this as well. The medical community should go arm in arm, saying, "Wait a minute," at the very least, say, "Wait a minute, we don't know if hormone blockers or transitioning is the solution, the medical solution to children who are
Yeah.
experiencing what they're experiencing. We don't know that yet. I think you and I know because it's kind of obvious, but from a study standpoint, we don't fully know. And doctors should say, look, we can't do this until we have the studies and the data. And instead, boop, they go right along.
I'm with you. I agree.
Yeah. Yeah. So, okay. So I want to talk about something that was that I've read in and learned on my own, and in looking at many of these cases of kids uh, who ultimately maybe even went on to being adulthood. So many of them started off, it seems, as though they had some emotional challenges, whatever they may have been from, just growing up as a teenager. We all remember that. There also seemed to coincide with that sexual abuse. Certainly, not in every case. We don't have a way of knowing every single circumstance, but it certainly seems as though uh, there's something else that needs to be addressed. Is that correct?
I'm of the view, I'm not a psychiatrist or a medical professional or clinician or mental health person. So none of what I say should be taken as mental health advice. It's just my opinion as a journalist on the front lines, having interviewed countless people
Hmm.
of all from all professional backgrounds, and parents and families who are dealing with this. Is that I don't believe anybody has only gender dysphoria, as it is called in the DSM-5, which is the psychiatric manual with all the diagnostic criteria for mental health conditions. Almost always, I think always, there are other mental health issues, psychiatric comorbidities that accompany what may very well be a very real body dysphoria, this sort of incongruence one experiences with one's sex. Trauma, sexual abuse are big because I've interviewed some detransitioners who they were either molested or sexually assaulted as young people, and their way of escape was thinking, well, maybe what was actually this obtrusive thought came into their mind that maybe my real problem is that I was born in the wrong body, that maybe I won't be assaulted again. I can protect myself by becoming this other person. There's the trauma. It does these crazy things with your brain to make you think. It's crazy making. And of course, I mean, and it's absolutely horrible because everybody responds to trauma differently. But for some, this becomes their way out. This becomes their escape. And it's why we need to have such compassion for people who are truly struggling, because you certainly won't hear me calling people names or, making fun of people. Now, it's quite different, I think, to see, there are those who are really struggling with this. And then there are those who are sort of the activists where they're roped into a contagion or they're watching too much pornography and it becomes this very odd subculture. There's not one, there are many sort of profiles of people who get mired in this kind of thing. But for some who are genuinely, tormented, mentally speaking, trauma, abuse, some other mental health issue is accompanying their other struggle. And if you treat those underlying things, you actually address the comorbidities. Oftentimes the confusion about your body, your sex organs, your gender, whatever you want to say, goes away on its own. And indeed, for most of all the literature is unified in its conclusion that for those who are truly gender dysphoric, if you want to say that, who are definitely dealing with these psychological issues, by the time they'll grow out of it. Most of them they'll desist. Puberty's kind of a cure. I mean, there are some exceptions to that, but that's generally the case. The model, it's been called watchful waiting, is sort of you allow these other processes sort of to happen. They'll grow out of their confusion, but also, just most importantly, you treat the other things, and the gender confusion resolves on its own.
And so something else we saw is, I believe it was in the documentary or maybe some other information that I've read, is that the one and only study that looked at transitioning as far as whether or not it had an impact on, for example, suicide, because you really can't run too many studies, because I mean, this, like you said, all this transitioning stuff happened about 5 minutes ago. But the one study did take into account, I think, going back into the 70s or 80s, and it found ultimately that there was a 19% increase in suicides among people that transitioned.
That's out of Sweden, right?
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
measured all of the postoperative, what were then called transsexuals, and they had a 19 times higher hazard of completed suicide when measured against population match control groups. Right.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And so, the case is that not allowing someone to transition leads to suicide, and we have zero studies on that and no way of knowing that, because again, we haven't had the time to study.
It's the biggest the most manipulative threat that's used to strong arm parents is, would you rather have a living son or a dead daughter, or they'll commit suicide if you don't let us do this. It's total abuse. I hate it so much that's thrown in parents' faces to make them go along with this. And people need to just reject that and put their foot down, because it's just not true.
So in your in all the research that you've done, and parents you've talked to that have come to you, helpless, why are our institutions, whether it's schools or even, I guess, doctors or society in general, seeking to sort of undermine parents, do things behind parents' backs, whether it's stuff in the classroom, making them read things, or if someone is transitioning, they hide that from the parent? Why?
Well, I go back to my comment from earlier about spiritual evil and this sort of social madness that just takes over. And when you can capture, when the ideologues can capture, and they have all the culture making institutions, when you get the tops of those and you can rewrite guidelines and professional procedures, and you'll do anything if you just think it's the right thing to do.
Mhm.
And I think concurrent with the ideological capture of the culture making institutions has been a decline in religious faith, where that would have been a bulwark against this, I think, 30 years ago. And now it's not as robust in the United States anymore. There are people, my publication is one of them, that are not going to budge on the material reality of sex and why it's cruel to do this to children and families. But a lot of people are just kind of going along, just trying to put their heads down and doing their jobs. But there is a certain social madness and a certain evil that accompanies all this. That's just undeniable.
Mhm.
Um, Gender ideology does fracture families irretrievably. Indeed, Jerry, I've lost count how many moms and dads have called me absolutely desperate, at their wits' end. They'll do anything to save their kids from irreversible medical harm. And in fact, in addition to the Tucker Carlson documentary, Transgressive, there's one that I think is even more powerful than that, and it's called Dead Name. Just two words, and if you don't know, that's transgender lingo for if you call someone by their given name who
Mhm.
identifies as trans, you're dead naming them. But the filmmaker of Dead Name, which you can see this at deadnamedocumentary.com, has told me, and she believes that phrase is kind of representative of the whole spectrum of problems that families face when their child suddenly starts identifying as the opposite sex. And so the family cost, I think, is, in addition to the medical harms, going to be what turns this whole ship around, because it's pitting parents against their children, spouses against each other, splintering families and extended families. The rupture and the disruption, the fracture of families, that is perhaps, I think, some of the most painful uh, damage that's happening to people across this country. But this film, Dead Name, profiles three families that have been ripped apart by that. And so I would urge everyone to go see that if you want to get a taste of these moms and dads' anguish, to see what this is really like and what this does to people. The
Yeah.
medical harm's bad enough. The family fracture is even worse, I think.
Yeah, it's unimaginable that this is actually parents are being undermined, as I said, and not
And
supported,
marginalized. And marginalized.
marginalized.
And
Yeah,
by the institutions where they should be able to get some help.
right. Yeah, and it's amazing to me. And again, I know the answer to this because you've answered it several times, and ultimately, it's the answer for all of these issues that
Right.
we've been lied about. Is it is just truly evil. But if you think about it, if you're under 18, you can't take a Tylenol at school. If you're under 18, you can't buy cigarettes. Under 21, you can't buy alcohol. You can't enter into a contract, and so
Right.
on and so forth. Those age. But the two things that you can do without your parents' consent is have an abortion and transition.
Yeah.
Isn't that amazing?
Well, and there are more. There are other things that you can do as minors, because there's insidious things that this whole movement, where minors, or the sort of mature minors, are able to
Mhm.
do apart from their parents' consents. But it does seem to be all related to these kind of sexuality issues, where that's the one thing you're allowed to do. You can't buy spray paint or alcohol or drive a car, but you can do this weird sexual stuff, and all that. It is pernicious in that way. I
Mhm.
think it's important, Jerry, that people know that I think the time, if you're listening to this podcast and you're, because these are so, kind of weird, bizarre, touchy issues, and you don't want to speak boldly because it's just so uncomfortable, the time's long gone. And
Mhm.
while you should absolutely treat people with compassion who are struggling, I think it's really important that everyone not make any bones about describing things as they really are. That you're willing to face down the grisly, sort of ugly, indeed diabolical evil that this is, and just tell it like it is. We need people who are willing to tell those hard, uncomfortable truths. To give you just an example of that, I interviewed a detransitioner who was, the way he described it, was like a multi-level marketing upsell to get all these drugs and surgeries. And he finally agreed to have his testicles amputated. He underwent an orchiectomy. And that poor man, wound up regretting it. And of course, he started experiencing suicidal ideation and major depression after his surgery. But beyond that, he even started ejaculating blood. I mean,
Mhm.
the carnage that and for what? He's not happier. I mean, it was
Mhm.
all a lie. But people don't like to talk about those kind of really gross things. But that's what happens. Like we're gonna have to confront the kind of horror that this does in the lives of individual people and to families and to society more broadly. We should insist upon sound ethical, good biomedical ethics in our country, and it's not oppressive or cruel or unkind to do so. We all have to live together, and if we don't stand up and be counted and speak truthfully on this, we can lose a lot very quickly, and indeed we already are.
Yeah. Well, as I say, is the most loving thing we can do to someone who's transitioning or has gender dysphoria is to help them overcome it and
Yeah,
address the real issues. The
right,
most unloving thing we can do is to encourage them and
right,
celebrate them.
right.
We would never celebrate someone who's an alcoholic or a drug addict.
Anything
We would
else? Yeah,
or is suicidal. We'd never say how wonderful that you're
anorexic.
suicidal. Like,
Right. Yeah.
yeah, you name it
Yeah.
exactly. And yet in this issue, we want to celebrate it and have Pride Month or
It's
whatever the case
insidious.
is.
Yep.
It's really sad. So yeah, we could. This is really seriously a very very big issue, and you're at the front lines. And the tip of the spear, so to speak, because of the knowledge and experience you have. So share with everybody where they can connect with you, buy your book. I was
It's
scrolling
free.
the name of the book,
Yeah.
Exposing the Gender Lie, and I don't know if you do this, but if you speak on the issue to events,
Yeah.
people should probably look at having you come if that's something
I
you
do.
do.
Yeah, I do sometimes. You're right.
Yeah.
Our book is free, actually. Jeff Myers and I, my co-author, we wanted to make this a free resource. So you can get it at summit.org. It's right there on their homepage at christianpost.com/ebook/gender-lie, and it's a free download.
Awesome.
I'm on Twitter at Brandon M. Show. And if you have Fox Nation, you can go watch Tucker's film Transgressive, The Cult of Confusion. And I'd also, again, point them to the Dead Name film about the fracturing of families, the gender ideology, that whole film, deadnamedocumentary.com. Small fee to watch, but it is extremely powerful. I hope people can see it.
Yes.
And I do speak. Yeah, if you can
Yeah.
send it to info@christianpost.com if you want to have me speak. We process those requests one by one, but that may be able to happen. So
Yeah, so there's lots of ways if you want to connect or suggest Brandon come or to an event of yours and speak or have him on your show. If you're listening, you have a show. I mean it sincerely. This is extremely extremely important
we
because
also have a pod called
yes.
Generation Indoctrination. Whatever you get your podcasts, Spotify, wherever. It's a series. We've checked that out. It's very comprehensive.
Yeah, what was the name of it again, Brandon?
Generation Indoctrination Inside the
Okay.
Transgender Battle.
Yep, perfect. Please, wherever you're listening to this right now, search Brandon's right now and get that as well. Appreciate it. So, Brandon Showalter, really great stuff, really great work you're doing. Thank you so much for all that you do and for coming on and sharing it with me and my audience. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Jerry.
Yeah, my pleasure. And thank all of you for listening to this episode of Fide's podcast. Please check out all my podcasts and all the different podcast apps on YouTube, on Rumble, on Wednesdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on rightamericamedia.com, and also now on whkradio.com/podcasts. Please check me out there as well. So thank you all again for listening, and we'll see you next time.